So my name is Karen Burns. I'm the CEO and co-founder of Visory, and I'll be leading the next panel. So with that, I'd like to welcome on stage Rainer Sternfeld from Nordic Ninja. He's the managing partner. And David Goldberg from Founders Pledge, who's the founder and CEO of Founders Pledge. And we'll kick off. There we go. So today we'll be talking about philanthropy, entrepreneurs, the state, and having a discussion around initially kind of company cultures, Europe versus the US, then kind of honing in on the individual level. So what does a founder or an entrepreneur have responsibility for, and what are our expectations around that as maybe society or employees? And finally, looking at perhaps best practices and things that we could implement to be better at philanthropy and corporate social responsibility. So perhaps we could kick off with you, Rainer, because you've recently, I think, relocated back from the States. So you have a relatively good idea around company cultures between Europe and the US, and also the government approaches between these two regions.
Right. Thank you. Thank you for coming. Thank you for having me. I would say the US, I should precede this by saying that I grew up with American television. I had the fortune to see American television even during the Soviet times when my dad set up one of the first illegal satellite TV dishes. So I grew up with NBC, CBS, and MTV, and so forth. And then I recently spent 8 years in Silicon Valley, and so I kind of feel that I have some visibility into how the US operates and how Europe operates and how the Nordics operate, obviously. And so one of the best examples is that, you have founders that are highly successful. They would commit certain quite sizable funds into either building a hospital or starting a charity and things like that. So philanthropy is very big. And then one might ask, why is that not so big in Estonia or Europe in general, especially in the Nordics? And then one of the answers would be that it's a very big question that nobody has really answered, I would say. But one of the problems that I've seen is that the governance model in Europe is highly different from the US. So I would say that we always look up to the US when it comes to innovation, resourcefulness, creativity, but we don't always look up to the US when it comes to social systems. And I think that we here in the Nordics place a much higher trust and value into our government, and we are ready to pay maybe higher taxes when we look at the Nordics in general, not only Estonia, and trust that the best people in the government will make the right decisions how to reallocate the resources, whether this is education, roads, healthcare, and so forth. So I think that's a really important difference, because it's not just, hey, let's give more, but it's, hey, what is our purpose? What is the goal that we're trying to achieve?
Yeah, absolutely. Mrs. President, what's your take on the kind of philanthropy and company cultures between perhaps Europe and then Estonia, having navigated both regions?
Well, I have to say I totally agree. Only yesterday I was asked a question that, well, your Europe, is really failing. The numbers are going up. The union is not functioning. It's all so horrible. I was like, I beg your pardon. My government just signed an agreement which for a small nation would otherwise have been impossible to sign, of buying the vaccine, because the European Union is making sure that we do not eat each other up, but cooperate and work together on it. And I believe that this virus crisis has made something obvious, that the social market economies of Europe and the people living in Europe, we do expect our government to be this last level of insurer and somebody who provides a system of a network of social security. These are words which have been used for tens of years, but what does it really mean? I mean, you can rely on founders, philanthropy, and all this, but there is this lacking network which makes sure that each and every one is somehow covered, protected. And I believe that this thinking in Europe, that the state is a provider and insurer, has proven its value this year in particular. But even before this year, I was in January in Chile, in Santiago, and people were protesting because they wanted a country which would look European. Mm-hmm. And I looked at the tax burden, it was 20, and I realized that, oh my God, these countries' politicians are in deep trouble. Because, you know, French may also be in trouble because of Gilets jaunes and everything. But the tax burden is half of the GDP, so the only thing they need to do is kick the government in order to handle the expectations of people. But in different types of state, they need to raise tax burden, which is quasi impossible in the global economies, because there is always somewhere you can take your money which will tax you less. Here in Europe, this has happened, and I think we should value and be proud of it. Which doesn't mean that the role of founders and philanthropists in US is not as valuable. Of course it is. It's just that somebody should make sure that the hands which are reached out to help people will actually meet.
Absolutely. What's your take, David?
Well, so thank you for being here. Thank you for the words. I tend to agree with both of what you've said. I think that, so as an American living in Europe now, I've also seen the difference between sort of the American system of there isn't a social safety net and you sort of get dealt the hand that, deal with the hand that you get dealt, and you win or lose based upon that. And in Europe, more generally, the social safety net has, to a large degree, shifted the burden of care from, in the US, people doing philanthropy to the state. Now, I think this is generally quite a good thing, but when governments can't and businesses won't, the third sector, or philanthropy and charities, play a really vital role in the provision of goods and services for people who get left behind by the system for whatever reason. And my organization works with entrepreneurs and helps them to sort of be more impactful people by getting them to commit something of their exit to go to charity. We started in Europe, and one of the things that I've been working against is this notion that philanthropy is less necessary here because there is this social safety net. So I think it's actually probably quite the opposite. It's never been more important now to have really well-intentioned and really well experienced philanthropists thinking about how they can make systems better overall, right? So this isn't in replacement of government, but it's in support of what government does and where it struggles as well. I think there are really good examples in the US, in Europe, and here in Estonia of how philanthropists are supplementing government systems, social safety nets in really effective ways that overall make society better. I would say where the European example is quite different is in the taxation systems associated with giving. So, for all of the faults of the US, and as an American, I can say that there are many, increasingly now more than ever, but the taxation system in the US really encourages philanthropy in a way that doesn't exist really anywhere else that I've seen in the world. Now, the question then becomes is that taxation system encouraging bad behavior and reducing sort of tax to such a degree that it makes government less effective? I'm not sure that the US is the best case that we want to mimic, but if you look at the European ecosystem, or at least European for the next couple of months, the UK's taxation system and how it incentivizes philanthropy is generally more robust than we've seen across the continent. And as a result of that, we see a lot more philanthropy. And from what I can tell, the taxation systems that incentivize giving tend to also result in bigger entrepreneurial ecosystems. Now, it's not a causal relationship, but there's certainly a correlative relationship between incentivizing philanthropy and the size of entrepreneurial ecosystems mapped by venture capital and liquidity and exit rounds to date.
Mm-hmm, absolutely. Before we perhaps touch a little bit in more detail about the tax stuff, you mentioned experience of philanthropy. So the experience of philanthropy in Estonia is probably quite short because we emerged from the Soviet Union not that long ago, and people were building up their own wealth before they could give back. So I'm hoping that's changing now, and that's also why we're on stage and discussing this. Is that something you agree with, that it's changing?
No, I have to say I disagree. Estonian people have been participating as philanthropists for all these 30 years. It is true that they didn't have money to give. But if you think how this country built its still not too good social security system, it had huge holes in it. Luckily for us, the money was available from Norway, from other Nordic countries who realized that this country needs some help to start building a social model, which our people were demanding anyway. But the work was done by voluntary people. So yes, we didn't contribute money, but huge amount of time has been contributed to developing social security in Estonia. All the model which we now have, which base itself on the most advanced Nordic practices, how to help handicapped people, how to teach children who have less capacity to learn, all this is done by Estonian people, started by Estonian people on a voluntary basis. It was normally quite painful why they had to do it, because there was no one else to help. But they kept on, even if the problem doesn't touch their own family anymore. And these best practices are now more and more incorporated into the state policy making. So you can be a philanthropist even if you do not have money. And Estonian people have been giving for 30 years their time.
Do you agree?
Yeah, I very much agree, and I love where Madam President took this, because I feel like we have this joke in Estonia that being an Estonian is a full-time job, and everyone that has lived abroad or lived here knows what I'm talking about, because there are so few of us. There are 12 times fewer Estonians living here on the same area that you have in the Netherlands, Dutch people living in the Netherlands, and so I would say. There are three categories where, just being very practical about the social responsibility of founders and founding teams that are change agents, I'd say there are three categories. One is a direct impact, where you either pledge a certain amount of money to a charity, or an indirect a project, a passion project. That's where I would place the full-time Estonian kind of a statute. I would say that we have all different hobby projects that we've taken on. The second pillar would be, I would say that when you're a founder or a founding team and you're building a business, you can always think about what part of my product or a service I could carve out and direct into the society for free, or some sort of another format where some part of a society can use it. So for instance, in my previous company that I founded, Planet OS, we built quite complicated technical kind of data platforms. And one of the things that we did, we worked with weather, climate, and environmental data. And what we wanted to do is we created the largest open data repository accessible over a single API that's available to everybody in the world. And that as a result, we would work with NASA, Climate Access Systems, we would work with NOAA, we would work in the White House Open Data Roundtable, all these different things. That was all pro bono, it was free. It was actually an expense on our behalf. Obviously, we made our name with that, but it was free, no strings attached. So I think that's an opportunity for all companies to think about what they can do to help. And then the third pillar, I would say, and this is more increasingly important, and this is what Madam President was alluding to in her speech, was, if you think about your business in 10 years' time, 15 years' time, and imagine it's, wildly successful, as successful as you can imagine, what is the social impact of that business? We can see how Facebook is impacting democracies around the world. We can see how let's say mobility from boat to Uber are changing urban landscapes. I'd love to actually refer here to an Estonian professor, Andres Sevchuk. He's at MIT. He's an urban planning professor. He just wrote a book called Urban Commerce, where he would say, how would we design cities now, knowing how we can move people and other stuff from one point A to point B in a different way? Do we need roads like this? How do we build cities in general? And then having founders study these types of things would, in fact, create better solutions. So I think that's a really important case that we haven't thought about before. And people get tired when I say this. Sir James Martin, who's passed away, he's a futurist to the British government in the late 90s, early 2000s, and he had this saying that in the 20th century, humanity learned how to invent stuff. we pretty much know how to make anything happen. Once we imagine it, it takes time and so forth. But the 21st century should be dedicated on how do we control that technology. And that includes impact. So,
Absolutely. David, what's the experience of philanthropy been like for you and for the US in terms of perhaps the government? What are the trends? So are people committing time? Are they committing more money? Is there a trend at all to philanthropy as a whole?
Yeah, so I want to make a differentiation between philanthropy and volunteer work and time. And I think that's what Madam President was getting to is I think everyone has a really important responsibility, whether or not you're a little child or a senior citizen, from all walks and all creeds of life, to give back of your time. So we didn't get where we are here in this room in one of the sort of brightest economies in the world by chance. It was built on the backs of people who gave their time for free, and I think that giving back time is a responsibility of every person who can do it. Philanthropy, for me at least, is a sort of a more active, making yourself worse off through giving away your resources. Now, worse off is a sort of negative framing of it, but it's basically giving away your resources for free without personal gain, ostensibly, aside from perhaps the positive signaling benefit often associated, at least with American philanthropy. When I think about philanthropy, I think about it from a relatively narrow subset. So the United States per capita is one of the most generous countries on the planet. This generosity isn't actually distributed evenly, though. It turns out sort of the median income family gives more of their average household income than the wealthiest 1% as a percentage of their income. So you see more generosity on average with much less wealthier people than you do with the wealthiest few. My line of work brings me into touch with the wealthiest few, or the potentially wealthiest few. And for them, there's often this desire, and I think it's probably positively held, that their time is more valuable than their money, right? And for most people that is the case, but when it comes to a 100 million or a billionaire entrepreneur, their time actually is best spent probably making more money, and their energy should be spent in giving away as much of it as possible rather than volunteering their time. So I wouldn't want the CEO of a deep tech company that's focusing on data platforms to go to a food bank and volunteer, because that's probably not the best use of his or her time. That opportunity cost is really high. I'd rather them donate quite a bit more. So in the United States, at least, with what we're trying to do with Founders Pledge, is we're trying to get entrepreneurs to be inherently more generous straight away, and perhaps most importantly, to be more effective with their generosity. So like all things, there's a sort of a distribution of impact, positive or negative, with philanthropy. And so if you think about like the best charities in the world compared to the average charity, if I were to poll the room and say, on average, if you had a little keypad, you'd say, how much better is the best charity in the world than the average charity? Most people think sort of it ranges between 5 and 10 times better. And that turns out not to be even close to the right answer. So the difference between the best charities in the world and the average charities in terms of the impact that they create is often hundreds and hundreds of times difference. And so it doesn't matter that you just give, but how and to whom you give, and with the effects that you're trying to create is perhaps the most important thing. And so in the US, we've seen giving for the sake of having your name in lights on a hospital, or lit up on a hospital, or the wing of a museum. And I think that this is something that we don't encourage. It's not that I discourage it, but I think there's much more effective ways to utilize resources than the signaling benefit. In Europe, we increasingly see when we convince entrepreneurs to give, or help them to sort of have a mechanism through which they can do the thing that they believe to do, they tend to give with a more impact-driven mindset, which I think is really good.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. Just to now maybe perhaps look at this individual level that you already brought in as well. How do you feel? Is there more of an expectation now from the state and from individuals to receive philanthropy and to make corporate social responsibility more visible, and especially in light of A, COVID, and B, in the millions and millions of dollars of financing people A, raise, and B, when we read about exits, perhaps we want that wealth to kind of go further than just the shareholders.
Well, I do agree with the differentiation between money given and time given, but I do not see the differentiation between big givers and small givers. Many people who earn less than an average income have set themselves goals about giving away 1% or 10% or whatever they earn, for example. And I think even if they probably don't think they are philanthropes, it's as valuable as what they're doing. And again, I would also see differences between corporate social responsibility and philanthropy. These are not the same thing at all as well. I mean, corporate social responsibility is when enterprises try to internalize as many of the externalities their businesses is creating, and this is very, very important to do as well. There are even global guidelines set out by OECD on how we should see corporate social responsibility. Interesting is that the guidelines are global, but the implementation and measurement is given to individual member states of OECD for the main reason that cultural differences, and I believe that a lot of what we are here speaking about, cultural differences are so big that you cannot apply general principles in the same way everywhere. And I think we should always keep this in mind, that you cannot say that companies in Europe should give more or owners in Europe should give more because and Americans are giving more and Europeans, for them the percentage is lower. I mean, things happen differently, but they happen anyway. I mean, we have good people who really care everywhere. You asked about corporate social responsibility. There is another thing which I would like to point out here. Very often people say that if you finally get also business rewards or financial rewards from being socially responsible, then this is like not the true thing.
It's marketing.
I do, disagree with that actually. I think it doesn't matter, because if other people feel they can contribute to being socially responsible by buying your products, in long term I don't see nothing wrong in that as well. And I really highly value this trend which we are seeing in Estonia of companies trying to hire handicapped people, for example, and so on, which the virus, of course, to a certain extent, unfortunately put a stop by a government action, which I believe was not really constitutional, which was that, I mean, people with handicap, because they have higher health risks, cannot go out, cannot go and do their work anymore, and therefore they lost their jobs. So I think we should always also be aware what we are doing and try to, even in the difficult times, not to interrupt and break the nice and positive developments there as well.
If I can just comment, so I really want to commend the definition you have of corporate social responsibility. It's the first time I've heard this on a stage before. So internalizing externalities is actually how you understand the true cost of doing business. So a true corporate, a socially responsible business is one that actually understands the cost burden, not just from the direct costs that they create in the first order, but the cost of their supply chains, the cost of how they do business, and the implications of that business. And so I think companies should be generally a force for good in the world. And too often we've seen companies that have had really long-run negative impacts try to sort of whitewash those impacts by giving, by doing all sorts of other things that ultimately benefit their bottom line. So I think it's really important that this definition and this idea that the true cost of doing business is not the cost that often that consumers bear, because it's borne by the world. I think climate change is a really good example of that. And it's borne by states and governments that have to subsidize the care of people that have been affected by such things. So I just wanted to call that out because I think it's important.
Yeah, absolutely. I just often feel that they're lumped together under the big brand of either social corporate responsibility or philanthropy or giving, and the whitewashing, I guess, is a really good term for that. And then often founders or company owners are giving away profits rather than personally gained money for the greater good. But again, to return to the pressure question, is there more pressure on founders to basically subsidize some of the social networks that governments have or have not built? How do you perceive that?
I mean, I'm not sure if I'm the right person to ask. I personally didn't feel pressure. I felt an obligation. I'm sure there are many other people that have the same worldview. You mentioned climate change earlier. I would say that the pressure comes from, for instance, in the in the coming years and in the previous, let's say, a decade and two, you have seen climate change increasing social inequality too. So the folks that are the worst off in different parts of the world get hit by climate change the worst in different parts of the world. And I would say that, I'm not sure if I would call it pressure. It depends, of course, where your moral compass is, but I would say this is a bigger task, and we would always have to think, what is it that we're unleashing when we create a company? What is the solution that we're creating? Are we just patching some sort of a problem here, or we create system-wide solutions? We all have 24 hours a day, so I think that's really important, just not to, obviously there are going to be people that are playing around with their ESG numbers, with their CSR numbers, whatever, but I think there are many people who feel this as an opportunity and obligation rather than pressure. I don't know, that's kind of like a carrot and a stick type of a thing, I guess.
I myself put a lot of pressure on some Estonian philanthropes this summer, actually, because, in the spring when this COVID-19 pandemic started, then our IT companies promised that they will do the Hoia app, which I hope all Estonians in the room already have in their phone, which helps us to warn that you have been in close contact with somebody with the virus. And this was agreed that it will be done as a voluntary work. State will not pay about it, because people probably thought they will have more slack in their workforce than they really did. For now in Estonia, the crisis was V-shaped. So finally, it was very hard for these companies to provide these resources for the state. But then we agreed that on 20th of August, on our national holiday, we will run the campaign to promote this Hoia app, and therefore I had put a lot of pressure on these people to be ready with this app. And I have to say I'm very, very grateful that they did stand up to that pressure and they finished the Hoia app. So I would invite everybody who doesn't have it here in this room yet, please download it and make sure you stay safe and keep others safe. Because if we do not use Hoia app voluntarily, then we will get an obligation to put our names down when we go to restaurants. I don't like that.
So I should say that I think that I downloaded the app that you're talking about. It was the one that I got in the email this morning saying, download this app to make sure you stay safe. So I did, and I did the survey. But to answer your question, my job is to put pressure on entrepreneurs and founders and philanthropists. So I would say that I probably do that more than anyone else I know, because that's what my job is, to convince people who might not otherwise be thinking about philanthropy, to help them to recognize the responsibility and the obligation that they do have. So obviously, I try not to apply too much negative pressure, but so I think that there's a really unique opportunity, and we're in a really unique time, sort of in the trajectory of human history, to make sort of sweeping and vast structural change to the way society deals with problems. Mm-hmm. And if I look at sort of the history of how change has come about, it's been predicated by markets and entrepreneurs on the back of technology. And we're sort of in the midst of the next wave of technology radically changing things again. And the people behind those companies stand to profit hugely. And if that's the case, then they sort of should be giving back at a level that might seem high to other people. So I think that giving back is an absolutely vital part of a successful entrepreneurial journey. And my organization is trying to reframe success from the number of dollars that you have in your bank account, or euros or pounds, to the number or the smallness of your bank account when you depart this world, right? So it should look like some beautiful arc where you have lots of wealth, coming up, and it peaks at some point, and then by the time you die, that account should be zero. You don't, I try to encourage, the wealthy entrepreneurs that we work with not to allow their kids to inherit the burden of that wealth, because it really is a burden. And this is money that can really be used effectively to combat some of our toughest social problems, in line with how technology is changing, how society in general deals with it.
Yeah, absolutely. I think when we prepped for this panel, you also mentioned Bill Gates being one example who has said that actually I will want to depart this world without any money and then give everything away during my lifetime. So I guess that's one good example of that. To look at perhaps best practices and something that you mentioned earlier on about how tax incentives can work for or against philanthropy. Mrs. President, what's your take on perhaps the Estonian system? Do we encourage philanthropy through our tax system, or do we do we not?
Somewhere in the middle. We do have a relatively low sum which we can allocate and then actually not pay tax on this, but frankly speaking, this is quite low and lumped together with some other deductions, so somewhere in the middle. On the other hand, as I said before, for me the question of before or after tax is and will remain important, at least here in social market economies, where first and foremost your obligation is to make sure that with all of our contributions, this state guaranteed, and I have to say it's pretty efficient and effective in reaching out to all people system runs. And if you then want to do something on top of it, then you can do something on top of it. So even if I'm clearly in economic thinking, rather I'm not even Austrian, I'm Milton Friedman, liberal in economic thinking. But I believe that that's why we set a tax in Estonia here at least. I mean, the taxes which we pay, they are, well, not totally non-progressive anymore like they used to be, but relatively non-progressive still. If you think that, I mean, however much you earn, you still pay the same income tax on dividends, the same as on salaries, etc., and it's not a high one, then its easiest thing is to pay and forget. And you are not spending hours and days and months to haggle with the state about your tax burden. I think this is already good enough. So I'm not sure we should say that there should be more tax breaks for more philanthropy, because our first and foremost obligation is to make the state security systems and redistributional methods as a whole running, because I don't know whether you know, but in Estonia, education is totally free up to the end of university. I mean, these are the large redistributional systems which are meant to make sure that in Estonia, each and every child has hope in this life to go far and quickly. And it doesn't matter that your parents earned nothing or that you came from really, I mean, remote area. You still had the chance to go to the good school enough to take it to the best university in Estonia, which is among the 300 world top universities, and studying there is free. So you see, this is something which I think we should talk more about. This is where we all contribute, not only those who are rich, but the others. And if we are starting to seek more tax breaks, we are starting to eat up this system. And then we will not have this capacity of even distribution of resources in society, because what I believe is what we most miss in US society is exactly this mechanism of general redistribution, which we have here.
Can I comment on this?
Absolutely.
So I wouldn't use the U.S. system as the exemplar of what should be done in Europe. Certainly not. I think for all of the reasons that we all know, that a lot in the U.S. is broken. That said, the question is not about tax breaks or tax cuts, but it's about creating the right incentive structure for people who otherwise would be giving less and have money sequestered in accounts that is sort of sitting there gaining interest, to actually put that back into the economy. So in Estonia, actually in the last couple of years, the personal income tax break has been reduced from 1,920 euros per year, or 5% of an individual's income, to now 1,200 euros. And the corporate tax incentive for philanthropy is also pretty low. I believe it's 5% of yearly employee payroll costs. So you're sort of putting a ceiling on the degree to which people are generous, because the incentives aren't set up for that. And of course, having a free education from the earliest ages through to higher education is perhaps one of the greatest things that a country can provide to its people, because education is empowerment, it's opportunity, it's all of the things that allow success to happen. I'm certainly not saying that setting up a system whereby taxes are reduced and that system is compromised is a good thing. But I think that there's essentially money left on the table that could otherwise be supporting all of the things that could make this country and the world a better place. So it's not a question of reducing tax coffers, but it's about optimizing the system for people who otherwise would be more generous to be so.
Yeah, absolutely.
Maybe a comment. Sorry.
I just wanted to say that I don't see that somebody needs to incentivize me. I'm myself one of those who have set herself 10% of the limit, which I will each and every year give away. And I'm not incentivized by what the state is doing or not doing. Yes, I do. I mean, support entities which maybe the local government even sometimes should support, like handicapped children, camps, and so on. But I don't do it, and I wouldn't do it less if the state, I mean, somehow incentivized me even less, I don't know, took away all the allocation. This is not the motive for me. I can understand that this could be if you have really big bucks to give and you see that, I mean, state will get millions or something. But I think most people are incentivized by the suffering of other people and that you can help somebody who is giving away relatively little. I mean, giving maybe away, I mean, 10% we know that with a reasonable income, this is not something which you really would suffer from. So this is what is the incentive normally. And maybe in our case, in small society, you're never that far away from those who really help, which might be the case for big philanthropists Bill Gates is probably very far away from those whom he helps. I here am not, and most Estonian philanthropists are not. If I think, for example, those who have created the fund, which is a truly philanthropic fund in Estonia, which buys musical instruments for young entrepreneurs who can never afford these kind of instruments themselves. Poor sense of philanthropy. But I've never heard from them, as somebody who represents the state that we should have more tax breaks. I don't think this is the case in small societies. We are incentivized by, happy eyes, which we personally see.
Rainer.
I had a comment around also kind of the distribution model, that if you look at the US, you have a number of charities, and that's not really the case here in Estonia. I'm not so sure about Sweden and so forth, but in general, there's not a whole long list. And as Madam President said, it's very easy to find, or you're very close to these people that need help. And very often, I would say that in terms of distribution model, what could incentivize is that if there is a project that a government is pursuing, let's say is opening up a grant for some group of activists or NGO, whatever, to pursue and solve, and then you would have to provide, let's say, a quarter of that these funds from the private sector. And so you could incentivize that portion of the private sector commitment to be some sort of a tax credit of sorts. But in general, the society is much more kind of transparent and smaller, obviously, so that you don't have to set up the same kind of structure you would have in the US here. So that's a very different just setup.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. We're nearly out of time. So I would like to thank you for all your contributions and the thoughts. It's been a really interesting discussion. And I encourage everybody to carry on talking about philanthropy and how to encourage this amongst yourselves and during the day today and tomorrow as well. So thank you. And yes, I guess that's us.
Thank you.